I never imagined that the child I once cradled in my arms, the baby whose tiny fingers curled around mine as if I was her whole world, would one day cast me aside like an old shoe. It is one of those truths of life that wounds more deeply than a knife. Betrayal always comes from those closest to you. I raised my daughter with love that knew no bounds, with sacrifices so profound that my own dreams faded into shadows. And yet, the cruel irony was that all those years of devotion became invisible to her once wealth came knocking at her door. The day she inherited $33 million should have been a day of joy, of pride, of celebration. Instead, it became the day she looked me straight in the eyes and told me I was useless. Her voice was cold, cutting, final. "Mom, you don't need to stay here anymore. I can manage on my own now. I don't need you." The words felt like ice water poured over my head. For a moment I thought I had misheard. I looked at her face, searching for even a flicker of guilt, of hesitation, but her eyes were firm. She had already decided that I should have argued, should have reminded her of the nights I went hungry just so she could eat, of the days I walked to work in worn-out shoes because she needed books for school, of the birthdays I spent sewing old fabric into something new so she could feel special. But my throat closed, my voice disappeared. I simply nodded, as though I were a guest being politely dismissed. And then, with hands that trembled more than I wanted to admit, I packed a small suitcase. I folded clothes with mechanical motions, each shirt a memory. The sweater I wore the winter she had pneumonia, and I sat awake for 3 nights straight at her bedside. The dress I bought secondhand but wore proudly when she graduated college. My fingers shook as I laid them in the suitcase. It felt less like packing and more like burying pieces of my soul. When the door closed behind me, the sound was sharper than any slap. I stood on the porch, suitcase in hand, staring at the house I had once believed would always be my safe place. I wanted to cry, to scream, to fall to my knees and ask why. But instead I walked. One step, then another, until the house vanished from view. The first night I spent in a shabby motel room. The wallpaper peeled in strips, the air smelled of mildew, and the bed springs groaned under my weight. I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how my life had unraveled so quickly. My daughter was a millionaire, and I was alone. The second night I couldn't even afford the motel, so I sat on a park bench with my suitcase tucked against me like a shield. The air was cold, the ground harder than I remembered, and every sound of footsteps in the dark made my heart race. The third night, exhaustion dragged me into uneasy sleep in a bus station, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing like cruel lullabies. It was on the morning of the 4th day that I found myself outside a lawyer's office. The sign on the door bore a familiar name, one my husband had spoken of years ago. I almost turned away. What business did I have with lawyers now? I had no money, no property, no future. But something, perhaps instinct or desperation, pushed me through the door. The receptionist looked at me kindly, as though she sensed I was carrying more than just a suitcase. Soon after, I was led into a quiet office lined with shelves of leather-bound books. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with silver hair, greeted me with a firm handshake and a gaze that seemed to hold both sympathy and respect. "Mrs. Sullivan," he began gently, "your husband left very clear instructions in the event of situations like this." Situations like this? My chest tightened. Had my husband foreseen this betrayal? The lawyer opened a folder and spread papers across the desk. The words swam before my eyes: trust funds, investments, property rights. He explained that my husband years ago had anticipated that wealth might corrupt, that loyalties might shift, that even family could turn into predators. He had crafted a plan, a game of chess where I was no longer just a pawn. "You see," the lawyer continued, "your husband ensured that the inheritance cannot be fully controlled without your approval. The power lies with you, Mrs. Sullivan. You are the key." I sat frozen, tears threatening to spill. All those years I had believed myself to be powerless, dependent, insignificant. Yet here was proof that my husband had always believed in me, even beyond his death. He had protected me not just with money but with foresight. He had given me the chance to reclaim what I thought I had lost forever: my dignity. Walking out of that office, I felt like a different woman. The streets were the same, the traffic just as loud, but something in me had shifted. I no longer hunched under the weight of shame. My steps grew firmer, my head lifted higher. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't drifting. I had power. That evening, I sat in a diner, my hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. The warmth seeped into my palms as I stared out the window at the neon lights flickering against the night sky. My mind raced with thoughts of the documents in my bag, of the power I now held. That was when my phone buzzed. Her name lit up the screen. My daughter. I hesitated. My heart pounded in my chest. Every part of me wanted to ignore it, to let her taste the silence she had forced upon me. But curiosity won. I answered. Her voice was different, strained, desperate. Mom, please. I need you. The irony was bitter. Just days ago she had cast me aside. Now she was the one begging. She stumbled through explanations, her words tumbling over each other in panic. People were pressuring her. Investors were circling, threats were being made. She admitted what she hadn't realized before, that without me, without my approval, she couldn't access everything. The millions she had flaunted were slipping from her fingers. I let her speak. I didn't interrupt. I wanted her to feel the silence on my end, to understand the weight of begging for mercy. For years I had been the one seeking scraps of kindness, of respect. Now the roles were reversed. When she finally stopped talking, waiting for my answer, I leaned back in the booth and took a slow sip of coffee. My reflection in the window looked older, yes, but also stronger. I'll think about it, I said softly, then ended the call. The power was mine. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was playing the game. And I was no longer a pawn. I was the queen. That night, I lay in the motel bed and thought of my husband. I imagined him smiling, telling me, "You were always stronger than you knew." I remembered the way he used to play chess, the way he explained that the queen, underestimated at first, was the most powerful piece on the board. He had prepared me for this moment, even if I hadn't realized it. The next morning, I returned to the lawyer's office. "Tell me everything," I said firmly. He nodded and began to explain in detail, walking me through accounts, properties, and strategies. For hours I listened, asked questions, learned. Each word felt like armor being strapped onto me. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was a strategist, a player in a game my daughter didn't even know she was losing. The following days blurred into a rhythm of discovery. I uncovered truths about my husband's foresight, about hidden investments, about allies I didn't know I had. The more I learned, the more confident I became. And with each step, the bitterness in my heart began to shift into something else. Resolve. My daughter thought she had discarded me, but she was about to learn that the story was far from over. Because sometimes, the pawn becomes the queen and the game had only just begun. When the third night came, I couldn't sleep. The walls of the guest house where I stayed felt closer than ever, like they wanted to squeeze the air out of me. My mind kept running in circles, going over Victoria's face when she realized I still held a piece of the puzzle she couldn't solve. She had inherited $33 million, and yet for the first time in her life, she looked powerless. And that powerlessness had a scent, a trembling edge to it, and I wasn't going to forget it. But fear still lingered inside me, fear that the same daughter I had loved, raised, and sacrificed for would go to darker lengths if she thought I was standing in her way. I woke before dawn, watching the first threads of sunlight creep through the curtains. My phone buzzed. A text. No name, just a number I didn't recognize. "Meet me at the cafe by 8. Don't tell Victoria. It's about your husband." My heart skipped. My husband. The man who had played his game so carefully, who left me with shadows and secrets instead of love. For a long moment I wondered if this was another trap, another move orchestrated by my daughter to corner me, to make me surrender whatever she thought I still possessed. But something told me this wasn't her. The words were sharp, direct, with a desperation she never bothered to hide. Sharp. I sat in the corner of the cafe, the smell of burnt coffee clinging to the air. A man slid into the seat opposite me. Gray hair, a weathered face, eyes like he had seen too much and survived it anyway. "You don't know me," he said, voice low. "But I knew your husband better than most. And I know what he left behind isn't just money. He left unfinished business." My fingers tightened around my cup. "What kind of business?" He leaned in, whispering, "The kind that gets people killed. The kind your daughter doesn't understand, but others do. That $33 million wasn't just inheritance. It was leverage, payment, debt. Call it what you want, but people are going to come for it. And for you." For a moment my breath caught. All I could hear was the echo of his words, heavy and thick like storm clouds. I thought of Victoria, flaunting her wealth, burning bridges, believing she was untouchable. She had no idea she was dancing on a minefield. And yet I couldn't shake the thought that maybe this stranger was lying, trying to frighten me into giving up something. But then he slid a folded paper across the table. A bank receipt. My husband's name. A transfer not to me, not to Victoria, but to an account I had never seen. The numbers made my chest tighten. Millions. More millions. The inheritance wasn't the end. It was just the visible part of a much larger iceberg. I tucked the paper into my bag, my pulse racing. When I looked back up, the man was gone. Vanished, as if he had only existed to plant the seed of doubt, the seed of fear. But as I sat there, I realized it wasn't fear blooming inside me anymore. It was resolve. If my daughter thought she had one, she was wrong. If my husband thought his secrets would stay buried, he was wrong too. I wasn't a pawn anymore. I was moving across the board, one careful square at a time. That evening, Victoria showed up at the guest house. No makeup, eyes red like she hadn't slept. She slammed the door behind her and glared at me. "They're calling me," she hissed. "Men I don't know. They're saying I owe them. That Dad owed them. That I have to pay. Do you know about this?" I let the silence stretch, watching her squirm. For once, the arrogance was gone. She looked smaller, younger, like the little girl who used to cling to my skirt when thunderstorms rolled in. "Mom," she whispered, voice cracking. "Please. You have to help me. I don't know what's happening." And in that moment I had the choice. I could reach out, cradle her face, tell her everything would be all right. Or I could let her twist in the storm she had created, feel the weight of the crown she had stolen. But something inside me whispered that this wasn't just about punishment anymore. It was about survival. If these men existed, if the debt was real, then both of us were targets. I stood, walking past her, leaving her trembling by the door. "You wanted the money," I said softly. "Now you have the responsibility that comes with it. But don't mistake my silence for weakness. I know more than you think." For the next days, the phone calls didn't stop. Men with cold voices, threats wrapped in politeness, reminders that time was running out. Victoria grew frantic, pacing rooms, tearing at her hair, her phone glued to her hand. I watched from the corner, calm, waiting, learning. The more she unraveled, the more I understood my role. She might have 33 million, but I had knowledge. I had patience. And patience was PowerPoint. One night she broke. She collapsed on the floor, sobbing, screaming that she wished she had never taken the money, never pushed me away. And though part of me ached to hold her, another part smiled inside. Because finally she was learning. Finally, she was seeing that life wasn't a game of instant victories. It was a war of endurance. But the war was just beginning. The night after the confrontation had left me sleepless, though not in the way it once did. Months earlier, a storm like that would have left me shivering, small, clutching at the edges of my blanket like a child praying monsters wouldn't crawl from the shadows. But this time I lay awake not from fear, but from calculation. I had seen the pieces moving across the board, and for the first time in decades I wasn't the pawn. The feeling was intoxicating, dangerous, and sharp as broken glass under bare feet. I could almost taste it on my tongue. Freedom, revenge, and something even deeper, the rediscovery of myself. Margaret Sullivan, invisible widow, had died the moment I packed my suitcase. The woman lying awake now was someone else entirely. Victoria's last words rang in my head, full of the venom she had inherited from her father. "You'll regret this. You think you're clever, but you'll end up alone. Alone and forgotten." She had said it with her chin lifted, her eyes burning with hatred. But beneath that rage I had glimpsed something else, panic. It was the same look Robert used to wear when he realized one of his lies was about to collapse. I recognized it instantly. She wasn't certain anymore. She had tasted the fear of losing control, and once someone like her loses the taste of power, they start making mistakes. I just needed to be ready. The following morning, the world outside seemed brighter, though the clouds still threatened rain. I dressed not in my faded sweaters but in a deep blue blouse I'd bought quietly years ago and never dared to wear. The mirror caught me off guard. For a moment I didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her hair brushed smooth, her mouth set with determination, her eyes alert. I almost smiled. This was who I should have been all along. The knock on the door jolted me. It wasn't Victoria this time. It was Sarah Chan, Carol's sister, the financial advisor who had walked into my life like a quiet storm. She carried her ever-present leather portfolio, her expression calm but focused. "Margaret," she said, stepping inside, "we need to talk. Things are moving faster than expected." I gestured for her to sit at the kitchen table, though my hands trembled faintly as I poured coffee. Faster than expected. Those words were both promise and threat. She spread the documents before me like a dealer laying cards across a table. "Your late husband's estate is more complicated than we thought. There are accounts offshore, properties held under shell corporations, and—" She hesitated. "Evidence of fraud." The word hit me like a slap. Fraud. Robert, my husband of 43 years, had built his empire on something rotten, something hidden under polite dinners and charity auctions. I should have been surprised, but I wasn't. I remembered the nights he came home smelling of whiskey and arrogance, the times he dismissed me when I asked simple questions about our future. The puzzle pieces fit too easily. "So that's why Victoria's been so desperate," I murmured, staring at the numbers. She knew. Sarah nodded slowly. "At least some of it. And she's been maneuvering to protect herself. The inheritance she received? Much of it could be frozen if the government opens an investigation. Which they might." She tapped the table lightly. "You're in a stronger position than you think." A shiver of satisfaction rippled through me. For decades I had played the role of obedient wife, blind mother, submissive caretaker. But here it was, the truth I had suspected but never confirmed. My daughter wasn't merely greedy. She was standing on a crumbling cliff. All I had to do was give the right push that night. Alone again, I opened the old wooden chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were relics of a life I had nearly forgotten. Letters from friends I'd lost touch with, my mother's rosary, sketches I'd drawn as a girl. Beneath them, wrapped in yellowing paper, was my journal from the early years of my marriage. My handwriting was young then, hopeful, desperate to please. I read the words like they belonged to someone else. "Robert says he's building something important. I must trust him. My duty is to be patient." Page after page, my younger self begged for validation that never came. I felt both pity and rage for that girl. She had given away her power so freely, not knowing how long it would take to reclaim. But now, as I closed the journal and locked it again, I knew one thing. I wasn't giving it up anymore. Days turned into a blur of meetings with lawyers, advisors, and investigators. Sarah guided me, steady as a compass. Each revelation about Robert's dealings added another weapon to my arsenal. Victoria's calls became more frantic, though I rarely answered. When I did, her voice cracked between fury and pleading. "Mom, you don't understand. They'll come after all of us. We have to stand together." Together. The word was laughable coming from her lips. Where was together when she threw me out of my own home? Where was together when she siphoned millions into her accounts while leaving me with scraps? Still, I let her talk, noting every slip, every careless admission. The game was turning, and she didn't even realize she was feeding me ammunition. Then came the day I received the letter from the federal prosecutor's office. It was polite, formal, but the meaning was clear. They were investigating. My stomach clenched, but not from fear. For once, the law wasn't a weapon against me. It was the sword I could wield. I pressed the letter flat against the table and whispered to myself, "Check." Victoria showed up at my door 2 evenings later, her designer coat drenched from the rain. Her eyes were red, her mascara streaked. For the first time, she looked less like the polished socialite and more like the little girl who used to cling to my leg when she was frightened. But sympathy is a dangerous indulgence. I folded my arms, blocking the doorway. "What do you want?" Her voice broke. "I need your help. Please. They're saying I could lose everything. The accounts, the house, even custody of the kids. You can't let that happen, Mom. You're my mother." The word twisted like a knife in my chest. Mother. I had carried her, nursed her, defended her from schoolyard bullies. I had sewn her costumes, stayed up through her illnesses, celebrated her successes. And this was how she repaid me. For a moment I almost faltered. But then I remembered the nights I had cried alone after she banished me, the way she looked down at me with disdain as though I were disposable. My jaw hardened. "I am your mother, Victoria. But you stopped being my daughter when you decided money was worth more than blood." I closed the door in her face, but I slid down against the wood after the latch clicked, shaking, tears threatening to fall. Refusing her hadn't been easy. Part of me screamed that I was condemning her to ruin, but another part whispered the truth. She had condemned herself. I was only refusing to save her from the fire she had set. The weeks that followed were a storm. News of the investigation broke in the papers. Robert Sullivan's name was splashed across headlines alongside words like fraud, embezzlement, and family conspiracy. Reporters camped outside the gates. Neighbors whispered. And through it all, I stood taller than I ever had before. Because for the first time, they weren't looking at me as Robert's widow or Victoria's mother. They were looking at me, Margaret. Sarah became my anchor. In one late-night meeting, surrounded by files and coffee cups, she studied me with a strange intensity. "Do you realize what you're doing?" she asked. "What do you mean?" I replied, rubbing my temples. "You're rewriting the narrative. Women like you, widows, mothers, caretakers, are always painted as victims in these stories. But you're not. You're shaping the ending. Do you understand how rare that is?" Her words sank deep. Rare. Powerful. For decades I had lived like a supporting character in my own life. Now I was stepping into the spotlight, even if the stage was built on scandal. The trial loomed on the horizon like a storm cloud, inevitable and heavy. Victoria avoided me now, her pride too wounded to beg again. But the silence was louder than her pleas had been. I knew she was unraveling, making desperate moves. It was only a matter of time before she tried something reckless. And when she did, I would be ready. On the night before the first hearing, I returned to my studio, the room I had claimed as mine. The canvas on the easel was unfinished, a rough outline of a queen on a chessboard. Her crown tilted, her face stern. I dipped the brush into crimson paint and drew bold strokes across the canvas. With each line, I felt the weight of years lifting. By the time I stepped back, the queen stood complete, vibrant, commanding. I whispered to the painting, to myself, to the world that had underestimated me. "Your move, Victoria." And in that moment I understood. The revenge I sought wasn't merely against my daughter or even my late husband. It was against the silence, the invisibility, the decades I had spent bowed under other people's choices. Every step I took now was reclaiming those lost years. Every decision was a declaration. I was here. I was powerful. And I would never be erased again. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and nerves. I had never been inside a courtroom except on television. Yet here I was, walking past marble columns with my head held higher than I ever thought possible. My palms were damp, yes, but not from fear, from anticipation. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, reporters scribbling notes, cameras flashing as though I were some unwilling celebrity. Months ago, I would have shrunk beneath the attention, tried to vanish into the background. But not today. Today, I wore a tailored gray suit Sarah had helped me choose, and when I looked at my reflection in the courthouse glass, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't weak. She was formidable. Inside, the buzz of whispers filled the air like bees swarming. The prosecution sat in one corner, their briefcases stacked with documents that represented years of fraud and betrayal. And across from me, at the defense table, sat Victoria and her husband, Kevin. My daughter's face was pale under layers of makeup, her hands clenched tightly on the table. Kevin whispered something in her ear, his jaw tight, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. The sight of them should have broken me. A mother is supposed to feel protective, supposed to want to shield her child from ruin. But all I felt was a cold, steady fire. They had chosen this path. They had built it stone by stone, lie by lie. And now they would walk it to the end. When the judge entered, the room stilled. His voice was deep and firm as he read the charges, and each word landed like a hammer striking metal. Fraud, embezzlement, forgery, conspiracy. My daughter's name, Victoria Sullivan, sounded strange in the context of those accusations. Once it had been the name I lovingly wrote on birthday cakes, on school permission slips, on notes tucked into lunchboxes. Now it was etched into legal history as a defendant. As the first witness spoke, I watched Victoria carefully. She avoided my gaze, staring straight ahead, her expression a mask of indifference. But every so often her lips tightened, her eyes flickered, betraying the fear underneath. I knew those tells. I had spent a lifetime studying her, loving her, forgiving her. Now I was studying her the way one studies a storm, calculating its path, preparing for its destruction. The evidence unfolded like a slow, merciless play. Bank records, forged signatures, offshore accounts, all laid bare under the harsh light of truth. Kevin squirmed in his seat, sweat beading on his forehead. Victoria sat straighter, clinging to her dignity like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. But the tide was pulling her under, and nothing she did could stop it. During recess, I stepped into the hallway, the hum of voices surrounding me. A reporter shoved a microphone near my face. "Mrs. Sullivan, do you feel vindicated seeing your daughter on trial?" The question cut like glass, but my voice was steady when I answered. "I feel that choices have consequences. We all taught our children that as they grew up. My daughter is no exception." I walked away before they could press further, my heels clicking on the marble floor. For the first time in years, my words had not been silenced or ignored. They had been heard. That night, back in my quiet house, I couldn't sleep. The trial had stirred ghosts I thought I'd buried. Memories of Robert's lies, of nights when I sat alone while he charmed investors at parties, of Victoria's first betrayal when she chose her father's approval over my love. I stood in my art studio, staring at the unfinished canvas of the Queen. Her painted eyes seemed to challenge me, daring me to finish her. I picked up the brush and dipped it into black paint, dragging it across the canvas in bold, defiant strokes. With each movement, I poured my anger, my grief, my determination into the painting. When I finally stepped back, the Queen stood completed, her crown gleaming, her eyes fierce. I whispered into the silence, "I am not your victim anymore." The following day in court, it was my turn to take the stand. My heart pounded as I swore the oath, but when I sat down, a strange calm settled over me. Victoria stared at me with something between hate and desperation. I met her eyes, refusing to look away. The prosecutor's questions were simple at first, confirming my identity, my relationship to Robert and Victoria. Then they asked about the documents, about the forged signatures, about the day Victoria threw me out of my home. My voice didn't tremble. I told the truth plainly, each word a stone laid in the foundation of justice. The defense tried to rattle me, painting me as a bitter widow seeking revenge. But I didn't rise to their bait. Instead, I looked at the jury and said, "I spent 43 years serving a family that discarded me the moment I was no longer useful. My daughter betrayed me not just as a mother, but as a human being. I'm here because silence only protects the guilty." The courtroom was silent after my words, the kind of silence that carries weight. Even the judge seemed to pause before moving on. I stepped down from the stand with my head high, my heart steady. Outside the courthouse, the air was cold, the sky overcast. Sarah walked beside me, her hand brushing mine lightly in silent support. "You were extraordinary," she said quietly. "I just told the truth," I replied, but inside I knew it was more than that. I had told the truth I had once been too afraid to speak. And in doing so, I had reclaimed my voice. As the trial dragged on, Victoria grew more desperate. I heard whispers of her trying to make deals, to blame Kevin for everything, to paint herself as a victim of circumstance. But the evidence was relentless. And slowly, the mask she wore began to crack. I saw it in the way her hands shook when she thought no one was watching, in the way her voice wavered when she addressed the judge. She was unraveling. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding. My home was no longer just a place of shelter. It was becoming a sanctuary. I filled it with light, with art, with plants that thrived under my care. Neighbors who once pitted me now respected me. I found myself invited to speak at local gatherings about elder rights, about financial abuse, about reclaiming one's power. Each time I spoke, I saw faces in the crowd light up with recognition, with hope. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or betrayed. One evening, after a long day in court, I returned home to find a letter waiting for me. It was from Victoria. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. Her handwriting was shaky, uneven. The words inside were a mixture of apology and desperation, begging for forgiveness, for one last chance. For a moment, my heart ached. She was still my child, no matter what she had done. But as I read on, I realized her words weren't truly about remorse. They were about survival. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she'd been caught. That I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, unopened again. Some wounds cannot be healed by ink on paper. The verdict came weeks later. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom, final and unyielding. Victoria gasped. Kevin cursed under his breath, and I closed my eyes. Not in triumph, but in release. The battle was over. Justice had spoken as Victoria was led away. She turned to me, her eyes wild. "You've destroyed me," she cried. I met her gaze steadily. "No, Victoria. You destroyed yourself." The flash of cameras followed me as I left the courthouse, but their noise felt distant. What mattered was the silence in my heart, the silence of fear finally gone. That night, I returned home and stood in front of the Queen on my canvas. She seemed to watch me, her painted crown gleaming in the lamplight. And for the first time in decades, I smiled. Not the polite smile of a wife, not the strained smile of a mother, but the true smile of a woman who had survived, who had fought, and who had won. 6 months after the gavel fell in that courtroom and the metal doors clanged shut behind Victoria and Kevin, I should have felt peace, but peace is a strange thing. It doesn't come quietly. Not after decades of being underestimated, betrayed, and discarded. It arrives like a storm clearing the air, loud, violent, and leaving behind a silence that feels almost too fragile to touch. That silence was what I woke up to one winter morning, the frost still on the windows of my renovated house, the one I had fought to keep, the one that was now finally undeniably mine. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I wasn't afraid of losing it all. I had rebuilt from ashes, but ashes have a way of clinging to your skin. Victoria had written to me again. 17 letters, each one more desperate than the last, but I hadn't opened this one either. It sat on my counter like a coiled snake, its envelope thick with words she thought would save her. I didn't need to read it. I already knew the rhythm. Excuses masquerading as apologies, manipulations disguised as regret. Prison hadn't changed her. It had only sharpened her hunger. She wanted something from me still, and I knew one day she'd try to reach for it, not with ink, but with her own hands. In those months, I had become something I never expected to be: visible. The woman who once packed her life into 2 suitcases because her own daughter told her she was useless was now a name in newspapers, a face on television screens. I'd been interviewed, photographed, even invited to speak at conferences about elder financial abuse. People called me the voice of resilience, a survivor who had turned betrayal into purpose. I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like a woman who had been cornered and decided claws were better than tears. The foundation had grown faster than anyone expected. With Sarah Chin's guidance, we turned my settlement into a force. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation for Elder Protection wasn't just a name. It was a weapon. We funded lawsuits, lobbied for laws, and created scholarships for law students determined to fight exploitation. Every check I signed was a reminder to Victoria. You tried to take everything from me, and instead you made me powerful. But power attracts shadows. The Hayes family hadn't forgiven me, not really. Eleanor had vanished from the spotlight after Kevin's sentencing, but whispers still followed me. Anonymous calls late at night, veiled threats from men who knew too much about my routine, a black car that idled too long at the corner of my street. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe it was the ghosts of Robert's double life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And when you've learned that your husband of 43 years was laundering money for crime families while feeding secrets to the FBI, you stop dismissing paranoia as imagination. One evening, Sarah arrived with another envelope, this one official. Victoria's lawyer was requesting a meeting. Not about forgiveness this time, but about custody. My grandchildren. They wanted me to bring the children to visit her in prison. Supervised, the letter said, as though supervision could protect them from the poison of her words. I stood there holding that paper, feeling a weight heavier than any courtroom sentence. The children hadn't asked for any of this, hadn't forged documents, hadn't lied, hadn't stolen. But they carried her blood, her shadow. And now she wanted me to be the bridge between them. When I closed my eyes that night, I dreamed of the children's faces, innocent, confused, asking questions I had no answers for. Why is Mommy here? Why can't she come home? Why does Grandma flinch when she hears her name? I woke up drenched in sweat, the letter still on my nightstand, a reminder that even in a cell Victoria's reach was long. The world saw me as triumphant, untouchable, a woman who had beaten her enemies and risen from the ruins. They didn't see the nights I sat in Robert's old study, staring at the documents that revealed his other life, wondering if deceit was something that ran through my family like a disease. They didn't see me at the cemetery, whispering questions to his grave that would never be answered. Why didn't you tell me? Did you think I couldn't handle the truth? Did you think I was just a pawn too, waiting to be sacrificed? But the most haunting thought wasn't about Robert. It was about Victoria. Because as much as I wanted to cut her out of my life like a tumor, she was still my daughter. My flesh. My failure. And sometimes, in the quiet of night, I wondered if her betrayal was the inevitable result of years of me playing the obedient wife, the pliant mother, the silent supporter. Did she learn manipulation from watching me swallow my own needs for decades? Did my silence teach her that power belonged only to those willing to lie for it? One cold January morning, everything shifted again. The doorbell rang, and when I opened it, an agent stood there, badge flashing, expression unreadable. "Mrs. Sullivan, we need to talk." Fear is a funny thing. After everything, you'd think I'd be immune to it, but the sight of that badge made my stomach twist. In my living room, the agent laid out photographs, men in suits, cash transfers, offshore accounts. Robert's world alive again. "The Torino family hasn't forgotten," he said simply. "And we believe your daughter has been in contact with them." The words hit like ice water. Victoria from prison, still scheming, still reaching. The agent explained. Letters intercepted, calls monitored. She was bargaining information she didn't fully understand, promising connections she didn't truly have, all in exchange for favors, protection, power behind bars. She hadn't learned a thing. Or maybe she had learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that in every system there are cracks and she could slip through them. That night, I sat alone in the art studio that had once been Robert's den, the canvas in front of me blank, the brushes clean. I thought about choices, about the life I had now, the strength I'd fought for, the peace I was building. And I thought about the woman who used to be my daughter, sitting in a cell, plotting still. The canvas remained blank, but in my mind I saw her face, beautiful, broken, dangerous. And I realized the war wasn't over. It had only changed battlegrounds. 2 weeks later, Victoria requested a video call. Against every instinct, I agreed. The screen flickered, and there she was, thinner, older, but her eyes still burned with that same fire, the one that had once been curiosity when she was a child and had now hardened into hunger. "Mom," she said softly, her voice almost tender. "I miss you." I stared at her, waiting. She didn't miss me. She missed control. She missed leverage. "I know you don't believe me," she continued, "but I've been thinking about what I did, about what Dad did, about everything. Maybe we're more alike than you want to admit." The words hung between us, sharp as glass. Was that what terrified me most? That she wasn't entirely wrong? That the fire in her eyes had once been in mine, smothered for years under obedience, only to reignite when betrayal forced me to fight? I ended the call without answering, but her words followed me, echoing in the quiet rooms of my house. More alike than I wanted to admit. One evening, I found myself painting again. This time I didn't paint myself. I painted her. Not as the daughter I remembered, not as the child with ribbons in her hair, but as she was now, a queen in chains, her crown made of barbed wire, her throne a prison bench. And behind her in the shadows figures loomed: Robert, Kevin, Eleanor, all the ghosts of greed and deceit. When I finished, I stepped back and realized it wasn't just her portrait. It was mine too, hidden in the background, the survivor, the witness, the woman who refused to be OWS. I cleaned my brushes, the phone rang. It was Sarah, her voice tight. "Margaret, Netflix wants to fast-track the documentary. They think your story needs to be told now, while the trial's still fresh." I agreed, but in my heart, I knew the story wasn't finished. Not yet. Because stories like mine don't end with verdicts or prison sentences. They end when the past finally lets go. And my past still had claws. That night, I sat by the window watching the snow fall, thinking about the future. About the children, about the foundation, about the shadow of my daughter that still stretched across my life. And I whispered into the quiet, not sure if I was speaking to Robert, to Victoria, or to myself, "This isn't over. Not yet." And in the silence that followed, I felt both terrified and alive. Because maybe, just maybe, the Queen hadn't made her final move. The night was unusually quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I sat in my studio, the half-finished canvas before me glowing faintly in the lamplight. Brush strokes waited for me, but my hands hesitated. 6 months ago, I never imagined my life would look like this. Free, independent, but haunted by echoes I couldn't silence. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the trees, carrying with it a restlessness that matched my own heartbeat. I wasn't the same Margaret who had once been dismissed, betrayed, and left to crumble. I was someone new, someone my daughter never thought I could become. But as much as I had rebuilt, shadows still followed me. It started with the letter. A prison envelope, the ink smudged as though written with trembling hands. Victoria's 17th attempt at reaching me. Sarah had left it on my kitchen counter, unopened, her face tight with disapproval. "You don't have to read it," she'd said. But that night, curiosity overcame my resolve. I tore it open, expecting more apologies I didn't believe, more excuses I didn't want. Instead, what I found was different. "Mother, you think you've won. But there are things you don't know. Father left more than just money behind. There are people, dangerous people, who won't let his debts die with him. If you don't help me, they'll come for you next." The words burned in my hands. My first instinct was disbelief. Another manipulation. Another desperate ploy to drag me back into her chaos. But deep down, something twisted. Robert had always been careful with appearances, but careless with the truth. Could there be unfinished sins of his waiting to devour me? I crumpled the letter, shoved it into the fireplace, and told myself it was just another lie. But sleep refused to come. The next morning, a black sedan idled outside my home. 2 men sat inside watching, pretending not to. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but my instincts screamed otherwise. When I left for the foundation office, they followed. When I returned, they were parked across the street again. For days it continued. Always there, never moving against me but never gone. I confided in Sarah, who urged me to call Agent Martinez. He came, listened, and frowned. "Mrs. Sullivan, sometimes power draws shadows. You're more visible now. Not everyone likes what you've become." His words were calm, but I saw the tension in his jaw. "I'll have someone look into it." I wanted to believe it was nothing, but unease curled tighter with each passing day. Then came the package. No return address. Left at my doorstep. Inside was a single chess piece, the queen snapped in half. My hand shook as I stared at it. It wasn't Victoria's style. This was darker, colder. Someone else was moving pieces against me. That night, I dreamed of Robert. He stood in the old study, papers scattered, his eyes frantic. "I didn't mean for this to fall on you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But debts don't vanish. They collect." I woke drenched in sweat, my heart racing. For the first time, I wondered if Victoria's warning wasn't manipulation, but confession. The following week, I visited her in prison. The decision shocked even me. The sterile walls, the cold echo of footsteps, the smell of bleach and despair. It all pressed down on me as I sat at the metal table. When Victoria entered, she looked thinner, paler, but her eyes still carried that flicker of calculation. "You came," she whispered, almost stunned. "Only because you mentioned Father's debts," I replied, my voice like steel. "If this is another game—" "It's not," she cut in, desperation cracking her voice. "They're real, Mother. The same men who gave Father money for his business expansions, who threatened him when he couldn't pay it back. They don't care that he's dead. They think you have what's theirs. And they'll come for it." I studied her, searching for the lie. But this time there was fear in her eyes I had never seen before. Not the fear of punishment, but of something far worse. "Why should I believe you?" I demanded. "Because I don't want to die in here, and I don't want them to kill you either," she whispered. "Please, help me, and maybe we can survive this." Her words clawed at me. For a fleeting moment, I saw not the manipulative daughter who betrayed me, but the frightened girl I once tucked into bed, who begged me to chase monsters from her closet. Only now the monsters were real. When I left the prison, the sedan was waiting again. This time one of the men stepped out, tall, sharp-suited, his smile like a blade. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said smoothly, "we should talk." I froze, my pulse thundering. "About what?" "About unfinished business. Your husband borrowed $30 million. With interest, the debt is nearly 50. He's gone, but you're still here. And we always collect." The ground shifted beneath me. 50 million, more than I had, more than I could ever give. "I don't owe you anything." I snapped. Forcing steel into my voice, he smirked. You inherited everything of Robert's. That includes his debts. Pay or lose everything. Again. Fear rippled through me, but so did rage. I had clawed my way out of helplessness once. I refused to fall again. You'll hear from my lawyer, I said and walked away, though my knees threatened to collapse. Back home, I paced the studio, fury and terror warring inside me. Victoria's betrayal had nearly destroyed me, and now Robert's ghost threatened to finish the job. But I wasn't the pawn anymore. If this was another chess game, I would play it my way. Over the following weeks, I dug into Robert's records with Sarah and Agent Martinez. The web was darker than I imagined. Shell companies, offshore accounts, forged signatures. My late husband had lived a double life, one of respectability in public and ruinous deals in secret. And now the predators he'd courted circled me like vultures. But the difference was clear. Robert had played alone in shadows. I had allies. Martinez uncovered evidence linking the men to laundering schemes and political bribery. Sarah traced hidden assets Robert had concealed, enough to shift the board in my favor. The confrontation came one stormy night. The man from the sedan appeared again, this time in my driveway, his smile gone. Time's up, Mrs. Sullivan. What's it going to be? I stepped forward, my fear buried beneath resolve. It's going to be justice. Floodlights snapped on, agents swarming from the shadows. Martinez himself stepped out, badge raised. Federal agents. Hands where we can see them. The man's expression twisted as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. His empire of intimidation collapsed in that single moment. I stood there, the storm whipping around me, my chest heaving. For the first time, the ghosts of Robert's sins loosened their grip. Weeks later, I returned to my studio, sunlight pouring through the windows. On the easel stood my finished painting, the self-portrait. But now I added a final touch. The broken queen piece painted whole again. Glowing in her hand as I stepped back, I realized the truth. Revenge hadn't been my victory. Survival hadn't been enough. My true triumph was transformation, into a woman who refused to be silenced, who turned betrayal into strength, who faced shadows and demanded light. And as for Victoria, she remained behind bars, writing more letters I chose not to read. Perhaps she would change. Perhaps she wouldn't. But I no longer lived in the prison of waiting for her to become someone else. I had become enough for myself. That night, I walked through my home, my footsteps steady, my heart unburdened. Outside, the trees I planted swayed gently in the breeze. The world no longer felt heavy with fear, but alive with possibility. The pawn had become the queen, and this time the game was mine.